Welcome to my rather messy little studio or workshop where I currently have stuff everywhere and I'm about to build a lathe stand, but let's carve out a little space to do some bookbinding. So a little while ago I sewed this little quilt design from fabric from my natural dye scrap pile with the idea of making a book cover. Lately I've been getting into making a bunch of smaller notebooks with fabric covers. I keep making them the same size because it allows me to practice and get better. And the size is great because I can make these books with standard size paper. It doesn't use too much either. If you've never tried your hand at bookbinding, it's a hobby I would highly recommend. It's relaxing, you don't really need that much stuff, and you're producing something actually useful. Because do you ever not need a new notebook? Or would like to have a pile of notebooks ready to hand off as gifts for Christmas or whatever, along with a favorite pen or pencil? I'm going to use some of my beautiful bookbinding tools, but you really don't need most of it. You can use stacks of books for a press, or clamps for a vise, a razor blade to cut paper, etc. What you really need is probably already laying around your house. Paper, a thicker board, thread, something pointy to make holes with, fabric or paper for the cover, and for glue, we're going to make my absolute favorite thing of late, wheat paste. This stuff is awesome, and all you need to make it is flour and water. And it works like a charm to attach paper to paper or fabric to paper. So, let me take you along while I make a small notebook using my new fabric cover. I'm not saying that everything I do is technically correct. I'm more of the philosophy, find what works and whenever possible make it easier for yourself. I'm just an enthusiast who's trying to figure this out myself. This paper is slightly thicker, it's 32 pounds, but you can use standard printing paper if you'd like that. I like this one too because it is slightly off-white, but that's just a personal preference. And the first tool I'm going to use, which is one of my favorites in the shop, is a bench hook. It is just a board with a hook on each end. It sits on the end of your bench or table and hooks in place, and then you have something for the paper to fold against. Not necessary, but just nice. Now, you can cut your paper in half ahead of time, or do what I do, fold the paper twice, and then cut it to size after sewing the signatures together. To fold the papers, I'm using a wooden butter knife because I can't find my bone folder anywhere, but you do need something to kind of push against to make the folds a bit crisper. I am using 4 sheets of paper for each signature, and once they're folded, that gives me 16 pages per signature. I'm making 4 signatures in total for the notebook, so the finished book will have 64 pages, if that made any sense. Now, these are all pretty bulky at this point, so the first thing I'm going to do is press them. A few hours in here will make them much crisper and easier to work with. This book press is gorgeous and very useful. You can build your own if you're into woodworking, and I'll leave a link below to the plan. Currently I'm drying flowers in it. If you don't have a press, you can simply use anything heavy. Books, a cast iron pot. Just make sure to first sandwich whatever you're pressing in between 2 boards for even distribution. Now, a little flatter, it's time to mark and make holes in the paper. If you have an awl, you can use that to punch the holes through. I'm going to use my favorite technique and put them in my vise, mark out the holes. Since this is a small notebook, I'm only making 4 holes. And then I'm going to cut through using a fine-tooth saw. You just want to make sure the pages aren't too high up, like they're not sticking up too high in the vise, because then there's not enough support. And you also want to make sure you're sawing all the way through your folded up signatures. You figure this out after a little while, like how far to go. My favorite part, sewing. Now, I've tried a bunch of different threads for this. The first one is bookbinding thread, slightly waxed. This is nice, but I'm running out of it. This one here is a thin, like 100% cotton thread. Don't use that, it breaks too easily. The next one is a thin polyester. That's okay, but I find it hard to bind it very securely and tightly when the thread is so thin. So I'm going to use this one, a thicker waxed thread I normally use for leatherwork. Since my paper is thicker, a thicker thread is no problem. If you're using thinner paper, you also want to use slightly thinner thread. Now, to make it a little easier when I sew, I'm just putting the paper on top of a box to raise it up a little. Sometimes I use a sewing frame to sew the paper around linen cord, which is a classic old-fashioned technique when binding books. It is really fun to do, and sometimes I bind books this way, but today I figured we'll do it a more straightforward way. See how the paper is still connected, like folded? That's okay, we'll take care of that later. When punching holes, you can do it however you want, but I try to think about make sure to have one hole on each side for the thread to enter into the booklet. And then you can do either 2 or 4 holes inside of that span. So a total of 4 or 6 holes, or more if it's a really large book. So I do one booklet first, and then I put the second book on top, enter on the end, and I put the needle under or like through the middle thread to connect the 2 books together. Then I tie the 2 strings at the end together, and then I repeat this with the third booklet. And when I come to the end now, I put my needle under the furthest section as well to connect the pieces securely. And you can also tie a little knot if you want. I often hear people say to not over tighten, like in bookbinding tutorials when it comes to sewing booklets together. But personally, I have found the opposite to be true. I often don't like sew hard enough, like tight enough, and then there's too much give in the binding. This is especially true if I use a thinner thread. So whenever possible, I try to make a pretty tight binding. Now I'm going to glue a little piece of paper to the back, securing it in place to hold the booklet together a bit more securely. And for this I'm using wheat paste, which is my preferred glue. You can also use PVA glue, or you can mix the two. But I love wheat paste because I can make it myself, and I'll go over how to do it in a little bit. But yeah, now the booklet needs to go into the press. And the next step, once the glue has dried in an hour or, the next day, is to trim the pages. Now, we want to trim the pages of the booklet. First of all, to cut those folded pages off, and also to make it a bit neater. I'm going to use my vise and cutter which rides in the vise. This is an old-fashioned traditional way of cutting paper that bookbinders used even before the guillotine was around. But first of all, we need to mark out where we need to cut. And if you don't have access to a tool like this or a guillotine, then an old-fashioned razor blade and straight edge will do just fine. You just have to make sure to take your time and, don't try to push too hard or do too many pages at once. But I'm going to use my beautiful tool with a wooden screw and cut all 3 sides of the book. So first of all, I sharpen the blade, then secure it to the cutter, then place the cutter in the vise in the track. And it works by advancing the blade forward using a wooden screw and moving the cutter at the same time. Now, let's focus on the cover for a moment. I'm cutting bookboard. This is like thicker boards, and I'm cutting them just a touch bigger than the size of my booklet. I also need a piece for the end. Now I have my 3 pieces. The fabric has been ironed and it's time to glue the fabric to the board. So, wheat paste, what is it? It's, again, an old-fashioned type of glue, common by bookbinders, who often combine it with like PVA glue for extra strength, although I usually just use it the way it is. It is so easy to make. You use a double boiler and combine flour and water in a bowl and cook it over the steam while whisking. I have made wheat paste many times now. Initially I followed a recipe where the ratio of flour to water was much lower, so it's really liquidy and loose. Actually this video here is showing a little bit too watery, but lately I've been using a higher ratio, about 1 part flour to 5 parts water, and I use about 500 milliliters of water. And basically you whisk, remove any clumps, and then cook it while whisking for maybe 10 minutes or so until it coats the back of a spoon, and then you pour it into a sterilized or very clean jar. You can also add a little vinegar to it to make it last a little longer. You let it completely cool and then store it in the fridge in between using. If stored properly, it lasts 1 to 2 weeks. So I usually do bookbinding in spurts whenever I have some wheat paste around. I love it because the texture is amazing, like a fluffy frosting. And I like it because you can use it on fabric as well as paper. And it doesn't leave any weird marks or spots like other glue sometimes does on like fabric or paper. The only slightly negative thing I have discovered so far is using it makes everything rather wet. So books and covers need extra time to dry in the press. And then I guess there's the slightly inconvenience of having to make it in the first place. But if you don't mind that, then it is pretty neat. I'm always slightly nervous gluing a cover together. It's the corners that really will make or break a cover, I think. The little details that show up if it doesn't turn out perfectly. But I do like the wheat paste because I can completely soak through the fabric, add more on the paper, even add some to the front on top of the fabric. If I think it needs it, it's fine. It's also forgiving in the sense that if it didn't turn out right, I can take everything apart and do it over again. Then once I'm satisfied, I put the cover in the press in between wax paper or parchment paper. This is absolutely essential. And the brush I simply clean with water. And the wheat paste goes back in the fridge until we need it next. The next day I checked on the cover and it was still a bit damp. So I gave it another day in the press before moving ahead. So now we have a dried cover. Turned out pretty good. With a quilted design, and you have like seams, so it's difficult to get it absolutely crisp. But I'll take it. Here's another cover I made a while back with marbled paper, using the same technique but paper instead. I'm going to use this cover as well. But to connect the cover to the booklet, we're going to need end papers. Lately I have been getting into marbling paper, which is so much fun, but probably another video. So I'm just going through my different designs that I've been making lately to see which would work with this fabric cover. The end paper gets cut to the same width as the booklet and then very carefully glued on using the wheat paste. This step right here is where you can really mess it up, or you can accidentally glue pages together, which is such a shame. You know, when you've put so much work into a book, to have that happen, it's so frustrating. So I try to be very careful. I start with gluing the booklet pages together, adding a sheet to prevent it from sticking, and then gluing the other side to the cover. And you don't want to make it like too tight, because then you can't open the book later on. So you want some like give in terms of how you do the seam, but not too much at the same time. Then once I'm happy, I add more wax paper around each last piece of paper. It needs to be around it and not just towards the cover, or else it might get stuck. Also, make sure to get the wax paper all the way in there, or it's going to stick together in ways you don't want. Into the press we go. And I'm going to glue some natural paper to the marble cover, I think. Okay, we are at the next day now, so let's take a look. You know, every time I do this, I am nervous. Did it work? Did things get stuck? But I'd say it's looking good. I think the marbled end paper fits well. It looks good, yeah. So I need to trim the paper just a little bit, but I know from experience to not do that now, but to wait until everything is perfectly dry. Because even though things look done, they are not. These books need to go back into the press for ideally a week or two. You don't have to do this, but if you don't, especially with wheat paste, things might not get perfectly crisp and the pages might bow and curl a bit over time. Bookbinding is a long game. Things take time, just like natural fabric dyeing or, you know, fermentation. Everything good, I think, takes a long time, bookbinding included. Here are some of my other attempts lately. You can see some issues. What happens if you trim pages before the paper is perfectly dry? What happens if the wax paper isn't perfectly tucked inside and the pages get glued together? That happened to me on a bunch of them. if you're using too thin thread and the binding is too loose, it looks like this. Or if you don't leave it in the press long enough and it doesn't dry straight, it's a little bowed and buckly. So back into the press. This was fun! Let me know if you have any questions, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more content on what I do here in my little studio. Things related to natural dyeing, bookbinding, sewing, and and other things related to living a creative life. I'll see you next time. Bye.